everyone. Let's talk about radio operations. This is chapter 8 in your text. So when you're flying out of an untowered field, like Bloomsburg, we already talked about that in the previous chapter, how that works. It's pretty simple. And then when you're flying into a towered field, things can be a little bit more complicated. But honestly, it's not so bad. I will say this, my experience has been, guys that train out of the towered fields tend to be really bad at the untowered fields versus the other way around. You would think it's the other way around that's going to be a problem. But most pilots that I've trained with don't really have that much of an issue talking out of a towered field, going in and out of that. Okay. So when it comes to radio communications, you need to remember IPADS. This is the order in which you will say things. Now, you're not going to have each of these elements in every single transmission, but if you do, here's what you will have. Identification, who you are. Skyhawk. Use the other marker. Skyhawk, 42 Tango. Position, I am 10 southeast at 3,000 feet. I have information, Charlie. So Rod talks about ATIS, Automated Terminal Information Service, which basically gives you the weather and sometimes some additional notes. It's normally updated about every hour unless there's a significant change in the weather. And they have a code. They start at Alpha, and they go to Bravo, Charlie, and they keep going until they get back to Alpha again. Destination, let's say I'm going into, Lancaster. I can say landing, Lancaster, or I could say for full stop. And squawk code, if I had a squawk code, I could tell them what it was. Of course, there's the 1200 code, which means I don't have a code. So these are the different elements. So I want to start using this framework and walk you through a trip to a couple of airports. We'll start with this smallest airport. It's a Class D airport. This would be something like Williamsport, which is IPT. So if you're flying there from Bloomsburg, maybe about 10 miles out, you're going to say, hey, Williamsport, Tower. Sky 42 Tango is 10 southeast, 3,000. Now they actually don't have ATIS there, but you can tell them if you have the weather. With weather for full stop. It's a very succinct way of saying, hey, I'm here and I want to come in and land. Once you say that, you'll probably hear something back from them like this. Skyhawk 42 Tango. Actually, should be 7842 Tango. You're not allowed to shorten your tail number unless they do. So you should start with your full tail number. They're going to tell you things like, winds are 160 at 6. Report 5 southeast at the ridge. Enter left traffic 12. And you're going to read it back. You always want to read it back. So you're going to say, report 5 southeast, left traffic 12, 7842 Tango. So whenever you call them, you start with who you're talking to. and then you tell them who you are, and you say what you got to say. When they talk to you, they're going to address you as Skyhawk 7842 Tango, or maybe just 7842 Tango, or 42 Tango. And they're going to tell you stuff. You're going to read it back. You're going to say, all right, this is what you told me, to make sure that everyone's on the same page here. And then you end with your call sign. Don't put your call sign at the beginning. If you do that, it'd be confusing, right? Other pilots listening don't know the difference between you and the tower then. So you always put your call sign at the end on a readback. You must answer them. When they call you, you can't just go, okay. You have to, at a minimum, you have to give them your call sign back. That's not ideal. But that is the absolute minimum response, because otherwise they're going to keep calling you and telling you again and again. Right? Okay, so you're flying in, you get to your 5 miles. And once you get to 5 miles, you can just say, Tower, Skyhawk, 7842 Tango or 42 Tango, 5 southeast, or 5 miles, because they know where you are because you told them where you were and they told you where to report. They'll probably come back after you say that, and they'll say enter left traffic 12, report midfield. So guess what you're gonna do? So here's kind of the picture. You got this big mountain. Here's your runways. There's sort of the river. It kind of goes around this way. So you're over here. You reported at 5 miles. And you're gonna report again here. And when you report, it's just gonna be short and sweet. Tower, Sky, 7842 Tango. Midfield. It's not wrong if you said midfield downwind for runway 12, but he's going to look at the window with his binoculars, see you there, and know that where you're supposed to be. And you're probably going to hear Skyhawk 7842 Tango, clear to land 12. All right, so you come in, you land, and before you do that, they just gave you a clearance. You're going to read it back. They might also give you the current winds. You don't have to read all of that back. The important thing is clear to land 12, Skyhawk 7842 Tango. Right. Now it's been recorded that you acknowledge that clearance. You come in, you land. All right, so now what? You've landed. The tower is responsible for people on the runway. Once you leave the runway, it's ground control that's responsible for you. So now, once you've landed, and here's the runway, and there's an available taxiway. Unless instructed otherwise, you come in, you land, you're supposed to get your butt off that runway. That is a precious commodity. Remember, we talked about hold short lines. You got your hold short lines here. You're supposed to get all of you off that runway at the nearest available taxiway unless instructed otherwise. Now, Williamsport's typically very sleepy, and they might just ask you after you've landed where you want to go. If you say, I want to go to the GA ramp or energy aviation, and again, this is something you should have done some research before you went there to know, where you want to go after you land. They'll typically say something like, okay, turn right on Charlie, then right on Alpha to this taxiway to the ramp, and often they will say, this frequency to the ramp. What does that mean? Normally, once you get clear, you would stop and you would call ground control. But if the airport's not very busy, the same person is probably working both frequencies, which is part of the reason you'll hear half of conversations a lot. So you say, okay, well, let's just assume that you're staying at that frequency. you read back any taxi instructions. If you're not familiar with the airport, you can say unfamiliar, request progressive taxi. It'll say taxi here, stop, taxi here, stop. Some key things you definitely have to read back. If they ever say taxi via this, hold short of an intersecting runway or something like that. Whenever they say hold short, you must read that back. You can't just say 42 Tango. Right? You gotta read the whole thing back. Because otherwise, if you have an incursion where you were somewhere you weren't supposed to be, you're the one that's in trouble, not them. Well, anyway, you're still the one that's in trouble, but they want it recorded that you accepted that clearance. So always read it back. Okay, so you taxi in, you go to the ramp. Let's say it's over here, Energy Aviation. And then you're ready to leave. So when you want to leave from a towered field, you have to first call clearance delivery. Now, many of these places, especially the little ones, clearance delivery is the same thing as ground control. So if you look at the information for that airport, you might see clearance is on 121.9, and you might see that ground is on 121.9. Speaking of ground control frequencies, they are often 121 point something. So sometimes they might say contact ground 0.9er. That means 121.9. Very common ground control frequency. Okay, so you're over on the ramp. You listen to the ATIS, if there was an ATIS. There's not at Williamsport. You're ready to go. They don't have a clearance delivery, so you call ground. And it goes something like this. You say, Williamsport, ground. Skyx 7842 Tango. Energy Aviation. Altitude's kind of obvious. With weather, if you want. VFR to Bloomsburg. Or November 1-3, either one works. Now, Williamsport, they definitely know where Bloomsburg is. So, sometimes if you give them an unfamiliar field, they might say, what's the identifier for that field? And you can say, well, it's November 1-3. I'm like, okay. So, once you call them, you're going to say these things, and then they will tell you, all right, taxi to the runway via this and that. You taxi to the runway, you get to that hold short line. When you're absolutely ready to go, you switch to the tower, and then you're going to call them and say something like this. Williamsport Tower, Skyx 7842 Tango, ready, runway 12. Now, if you're not at the end, if you're at an intersection, you have to say the intersection. So you might have to say something like runway 12 Alpha 1 if you're not at the exact end of the runway. They'll come back and they're going to say one of three things. There's the one that you want, cleared, or pickoff. They might say hold short, and they'll probably give you a reason. Hold short, landing traffic. Hold short, traffic landing runway 9. Traffic departing runway 9. They don't have to give you a reason. Again, if you hear the words hold short, you better read it back. And the third option is line up and wait. This used to be called position and hold. You taxi into position at the end of the runway and then hold your position. But they changed this terminology to match the international traffic more. So now it's line up and wait. You should read back all of these clearances. It's going to be clear for takeoff, Skyx 7842 Tango. And you go. When they say clear for takeoff, move. Don't sit around. Right? Again, runway, precious commodity. Don't sit on your butt. Move. I was in Allentown a couple days ago. I was fourth in line for takeoff. There's another Cessna in front of me. He taxied to the end of the runway very slowly and then stopped, came to a complete stop on a runway that was 6,800 feet long. He didn't need to come to a complete stop to take off in a 172. It was absolutely ridiculous. Don't be that guy. So yeah, clear for takeoff. Technically, you don't have to read back that clearance, but if you don't, my experience has been that they're going to come after you and they'll be like, hey, did you get that? And you're like, I'm rolling down the runway. Yes, I got it. But they want it recorded. Hold short, got to read that back. Line up and wait, got to read that back. You take off. Now what? Well, typically, most airports around here at least, you just fly outside of the airspace and they stop talking to you. Some airports will explicitly tell you frequency change approved. You know, let's say you're going to a nearby airport that's not towered and you say, hey, I got that airport in sight. They'll say frequency change approved. Okay, so that's a Class D airport. What if I go to something a little bit bigger? And that would be Allentown. So I'm going to go to ABE. Coming from Bloomsburg, when I'm 20 miles away or so, I'll call them up. Now, before I call them, I'm going to try to get the ATIS. And then my initial call will be something like this. Allentown. I can say Allentown approach, or I can just say Allentown if I'm feeling lazy. Skyx 7842 Tango. 20, probably be 20 northwest. Let's say that I'm going at 3,500. By the way, that's how you say that, 3,500. It's not 3,500. If it was over 10, it's not 10,500, it's 10,500. With, let's say it's ATIS Charlie for full stop. They'll come back. They'll say something like this. Skyx 7842 Tango. Squawk, you know, whatever code, 0234. They might say squawk 0234 and ident. That means put that in your transponder. If they ask you to ident, mash the ident button. If they don't ask you to ident, don't mash the ident button. Don't be that guy. Right? So you call them back and you say, all right, 0234. And they might give you an altimeter setting, even though you told them you had the weather. Sometimes you just read it back. 3025. You fly in, they talk to you a little bit. They might say, report the field in sight. Eventually, you call them up and you say, Allentown, Skyx 7842 Tango, as field in sight. And now what? They're probably going to switch you over to the tower. So now they'll say, all right, contact tower on this frequency. Good day. And you say, over to tower on this frequency. Good day. Right. Get that frequency dialed in. And now you're going to call the tower. Allentown Tower, Skyhawk 7842 Tango with you. You can give them your altitude or whatever, but you were handed off. They know where you are. They know what you're there for. They know you want to land. So you come in, and now it's pretty much like Williamsport. You do what they tell you. You read back your clearances. You land. You get off the runway. Contact ground. You should look up the ground frequency, have it in your standby in your radio so you know what to do. Contact the ground controllers, tell them where you want to go. You taxi there, you stop, and now what? Now what are you going to do? By the way, if you go to Allentown, you probably want to go to Hangar 7 is the place that you're probably going to go. It's a nice FBO there. I was there a few days ago, as I said. Nice people. Managed to get a courtesy car so I can do my 1.5 mile trip to pick something up and fly home. Also got some really great Indian food there too. But so talk to the ground controllers. You go into your land. All right, now it's time to go home. So what are you going to do? First thing you're going to do is you're going to listen to ATIS when you're ready to depart. Then you're going to call clearance, delivery. Say Allentown clearance. And you're going to tell them something like this: Sky 7842 Tango at Hangar 7 with, maybe now it's Echo. You've been there a while. VFR. November 1-3. They're going to call you back. They're going to give you a clearance. Now, how do I record a clearance? Good question. Here's something that the IFR guys use all the time. It's called craft. Clearance limit. The route, altitude, frequency, transponder. Now, clearance limit isn't really relevant often when it comes to VFR people, but this is still a useful thing, right? So they're going to say something like this: Sky 7842 Tango. On departure, fly runway heading, very common one, or a certain heading, but runway heading is pretty common. Maintain VFR at or below 3,000. Departure frequency 12445, squawk 0422. You're going to read that back. You're going to say clearance, Sky, well, you don't even have to say clearance, but you can say runway heading, maintain VFR at or below 3,000 feet, departure frequency 124.45, squawk 0422. Then they'll say read back correct. Now, often at a place like Allentown, they will actually ask you, advise ready to taxi. Why would they say that? Because the guy that's doing clearance is probably also doing the ground control. So you can say, all right, I'm ready to taxi. Then they'll give you taxi instructions. Might not always happen. So if that doesn't happen, then you need to call ground control explicitly. So you call ground control. You say, Allentown, ground, Skyhawk, 7842 Tango at Hangar 7, ready to taxi. They'll call you back. Sky 7842 Tango, taxi to runway 9 via this and that. Right? You read it all back. Same story as Williamsport. You taxi out, you get to the hold short line. When you're number 1 for takeoff and you're ready to go, then you switch to the tower. It's the exact same thing. I'm ready for takeoff, here's where I am. If I'm at the end, I can say runway 9. If I'm not at the end of runway 9 at alpha 2, alpha 1, I have to tell them that. I'll get those same 3 responses. I take off. After I get in the air, the tower will say contact departure. And often they'll repeat the frequency. Contact departure 124.45. You say over to departure, good day. Change that frequency. What are you going to tell departure? Departure, Sky 7842 Tango with you. Here's the funny thing. You come out of these Class C airports, 90% of the time, whatever they told you back here, throw it out the window. I say 90% of the time, you should still write this stuff down and remember it. They'll probably say, on course approved, VFR climb, your discretion. Which just means go ahead and climb up to whatever altitude you wanted and turn on course. Which is exactly what I got coming out of Allentown. Originally they said turn to this heading, and then later they're like, okay, you can climb to your altitude. And I had to ask them, am I approved for on course? And they said yes. Right. So they said affirmative, not yes, right? Affirmative and negative is what we use. So that is a Class C airport. All right, what about the big airports? You get to a big airport, Class B. That's things like Philadelphia, Atlanta, Chicago, New York. So Class B is a little bit different. So if you're going into a Class B, what's the biggest thing that you need to know? You must be explicitly approved to go into the Class B. And you probably will not be approved to go into the Class B in most cases. They don't like to let you in there. A couple weeks ago, I went into Linden, New Jersey, which is 3 miles from Newark. It is right below the Class B. The Class B starts at 800 feet above that airport, and the airport elevation is 22 feet. So it's kind of crazy, and then actually if you go too far to either side, it goes down to 500 feet. And then of course you go a little bit north, it's down to the surface. So you have to be super careful not to nick that Class B. So Class B, you have to be explicitly cleared to enter. When you call up the approach controller, so let's say you're approaching New York, and you say, New York's, well, first you're talking to New York Center, but we'll get to that. Call it New York approach, and you say, New York approach, Skyhawk, 7842 Tango, 30 west, 3,500, inbound, Linden. They're probably going to say, Skyhawk 7842 Tango, remain clear, Class Bravo. And be ready. In this case, we were flying, we were going kind of fast. We had to make a really rapid descent. So we had to descend at about 1,000 foot per minute, in part because we did a powered descent. So we were going maybe 170 knots, their direction, while we're trying to get down, to get below that upside down wedding cake that is most Class B airspaces. So just be aware of that. Now, Linden is untowered, so we basically flew underneath it, and then we just contacted the CTAF at Linden, just like it was Bloomsburg, essentially, except for, things are a little bit tighter down there, and the traffic pattern's lower. So what if you were going to, let's say you're going to Philly? Well, first of all, as a student pilot, you can't go there unless you had an endorsement. And even if you have an endorsement, they probably don't want you. So let's say you were going to Philly for some reason. Now, honestly, you probably don't have a good reason that you want to go to Philly. Well, in general, that's true. But you don't want to go to the big airport in Philly because there's not really a place for you once you land there. It's like Atlanta. People are like, hey, you want to fly down to Atlanta? I'm like, well, we could, but once you land, there's nowhere to go. It's not really set up for general aviation. But they can't legally deny you the right to land there. They can just make you not want to do it by charging you lots of fees and things like that. And having $9 a gallon fuel and other things. Okay, so let's say you want to go to Philly. You can call them up. Philadelphia approach. This guy's going to be 42 Tango. I guess if we're going to Philly, we're probably going to be more northwest. Maybe we're 30 northwest at 5,500 with Echo destination DHL. Now they have to let you in because you're landing there. So you call them up, what's going to happen? They're going to call you back, and it's going to be like the Class C airport. They're going to say, okay, now what are you going to do? You're going to do what they say. They're going to give you a clearance, you're going to read it back, do what they say, you come in, eventually they'll flip you over to the tower, ground control, coming back out, it's the exact same thing, clearance, delivery, ground control, tower. Right? Now, by the way, when you get to these big airports, they don't usually have one tower frequency or one ground control frequency. They will have multiple frequencies for ground control and for different runways. So if the tower for this runway is this frequency and for another runway it's a different frequency. That's because they have so much traffic. You go to Atlanta, you'll notice they have a ton of different frequencies and it can be very confusing. Honestly, I would say definitely as a student pilot, could you get an endorsement to fly into Class B? Yes, you can get the endorsement, and you shouldn't be landing at the primary airport. You shouldn't be landing at Philly. If you ever, for some reason, wanted to land at a place like Philly, even if you had a license, but you'd never done it before, I would recommend you get with a CFI and do that. You know, the pressure, if you're flying this by yourself and you're not real comfortable on radios, it's just too much pressure. I would say, get with somebody at least one time and do that. I've flown with pilots before. They said, hey, I want to make a dry run. I'm going to make this trip. Can you fly with me so I won't sound like an idiot when I do this for real? And I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. Okay. Another kind of airport, something we actually have around here is called a TARSA, Terminal Radar Service Area. That's what we have in Wilkes-Barre. Now, what's the story with this? A TARSA is normally found at either a dual-use civilian military base or at a civilian airport that is very close to a military base. So you look at Wilkes-Barre, they also have a military presence there. If you look at, say, Macon, Georgia, they do not have a military presence at that field, but they are very close to an Air Force base. So the Air Force base is actually the one providing these services. It's not people at Macon, at the airport. Funny thing about landing in Macon is when you land there, they'll ask you, how many runways do you see? Because those two airports are very close, and occasionally people land at the wrong one. The wrong one would be the military base. They don't really like it if you land there without a clearance. It's kind of bad. So a TARSA. A TARSA is like a Class B, except for it's optional. You can participate in the TARSA if you're not going to Wilkes-Barre itself. You don't have to participate. Let's say you're going to Wyoming Valley. You don't have to call them, but why wouldn't you call them? Right? They can provide some nice services. So that leads us into this discussion. So Wilkes-Barre can give you things like flight following. So let's say I'm going to, let's say, just for sake of argument, I'm going to go to Wyoming Valley. I could call it Wilkes-Barre, and it could go something like this. I take off from here. I can say Wilkes, Skyhawk, Wilkes-Barre, whatever you want to call them. 7842 Tango. Occasionally you'll hear people call them Wilkes because, they're not sure which of the three pronunciations of that city they should use. Right? You've heard Wilkes-Barre, 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 and depending on who you ask, they might have their preferred pronunciation. So I have heard like some airline guys in particular, they'll just be like Wilkes. Okay. That still works. Sky 7842 Tango off Bloomsburg or, to east Bloomsburg. Let's say I'm to east of Bloomsburg. At 3,000. Destination, Wyoming Valley. Request, VFR, advisories. Some people will say looking for flight following, which technically isn't correct. You're technically asking for VFR advisories, which we all call flight following. So Wilkes-Barre, Skyhawk 7842 Tango, 2 east, north, Bloomsburg, 3,000. Inbound, Wyoming Valley, request VFR advisories. They'll probably call you back and say something like, Skyhawk 7842 Tango, squawk, 0234 and ident. Squawk 0234 and ident. And they might also say Wilkes-Barre altimeter, 3025. You read that back. And then you'll hear them say radar contact, and here's your position. You're maybe this much north of Hazleton by then. And you just go along your way, and they might say, hey, report Wyoming Valley in sight. If they don't tell you to do that, you should probably tell them when you see it, because then they'll say frequency change approved, radar services terminated, squawk VFR, which means go back to 1200 transponder, and then you contact at Wyoming Valley, 122.8, just like landing in blue. So that's one scenario. So flight following is something you can get from the local controllers. Well, who are the local controllers? You might have someone like Wilkes-Barre, and then there's the guys that fill in the gaps. And those are the ARTC. So the ARTC guys, are the air route traffic control centers. So in this area, that would be New York Center. Now it's a little bit confusing because often they have the same name as like Class B airspace, like New York. So you would call them up and you'd say, New York Center, I want to do this. I want to get flight following. So like, let's say I'm going to Williamsport or State College, and I call it Wilkes-Barre because they cover this area, and I say, hey, can I get VFR advisories? I'm going to State College. Or University Park is the name of the airport. They'll probably say, contact New York Center on this frequency. Or if I'm going to the south, I might start with Wilkes-Barre They might hand me off to Pittsburgh, being able to pick them up, where they'll say contact them on this frequency. You call them and nobody answers. You call them and nobody answers. I'm not sure why. So that's flight following. How do you get that from your local controlling agency? How do you know what they are? Well, you look it up. If you look in your electronic flight bag, say, for this airport, it'll say, hey, Wilkes-Barre. Now, by the way, it'll say the wrong frequency for Wilkes-Barre. They'll tell you it's pretty much 120.95 is the frequency you should always use for them, no matter what it says in the books, unless they tell you to go to the other frequency. So, just a little tidbit on Wilkes-Barre. All right. Other things to know. Emergency frequency, 121.5 megahertz. That's the emergency frequency. Many radios have a shortcut for dialing that in. If you have a Garmin radio, depending on the model, if you have a physical frequency flip-flop button and you push and hold it for 5 seconds, it will put 121.5 in your active frequency. If you have a touchscreen Garmin GPS Navcom, like a Garmin 650 or 750, they don't have a physical flip-flop button, but they do have a physical volume knob. If you push that in for 5 seconds, it will do the same thing. If you have an emergency, the correct way to say you have an emergency is Mayday, 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 and then what's going on? You know, where are you? What's happening to you? You can also use pan, pan, pan if you have an urgent situation that's not an emergency. Now, if you do have an emergency, declare an emergency. There's some guys that are, I think we've talked about this before. They're hesitant to declare an emergency because they think they'll get in trouble or something. If you have an emergency, declare an emergency. That lets them help you. Ryan talks a little bit about things like transponders, different transponder codes. We said that we have our 1200, which is VFR. 7500 means I've been hijacked. If you're squawking 7500, they will never say, verify squawking hijack code. That would be very bad for you. Instead, they'll say, verify squawking 7500. 760 means my radio's busted. 7700 means I have a mayday. So when I got to land an aircraft in the woods in eastern Georgia one day, that's what I was squawking. In fact, I went to the teardown of the engine that the NTSB did later, and this was still on the transponder. It was still at 7700. So transponders normally have an altitude encoder. So if you go to the alt position, sometimes called mode C, that will send your altitude to HTC. Ident button, we talked about that a little bit before. You only push that if they ask. It makes you kind of blossom on their radar screen. And that is pretty much chapter 8, which is all about radio communications.